Sometimes the place that changes your life is not a place at all. Sometimes it is a person who quietly teaches your heart how to feel at home again. I did not always understand that. For most of my adult life, I believed happiness was something carefully arranged, like the shelves inside my bookstore where every novel belonged exactly where readers expected to find it. Predictability felt safe. Routine felt dependable. After my divorce nearly 4 years earlier, I stopped searching for grand adventures and settled into a life measured by morning coffee, handwritten book recommendations, and quiet conversations with strangers who wandered through my little bookstore looking for stories that might somehow explain their own lives. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 41 years old, I owned an independent bookstore tucked between an old bakery and a neighborhood flower shop in Boston. It was never the largest bookstore in the city, but people often told me it was one of the warmest. They said the sunlight pouring through the tall front windows during late afternoon painted every wooden bookshelf with a soft golden glow that made the entire place feel peaceful. One customer smiled one evening and called it golden ambience. I laughed politely at the phrase, but after she left, I found myself repeating those words quietly while locking the front door. Golden ambience. It sounded less like interior design and more like a feeling that everyone secretly spent their lives chasing. Every morning began almost exactly the same. I unlocked the door at 8 o'clock, switched on the antique lamps scattered throughout the store, brewed fresh coffee, and placed a small vase of seasonal flowers beside the register before opening my favorite reading chair near the front window. Some people believed bookstores survived because they sold books. I believed they survived because they gave people permission to slow down. Children wandered through fantasy shelves with wide eyes. College students searched for inspiration before exams, retirees spent entire afternoons discussing classic literature, and travelers often stumbled inside simply because the bookstore looked inviting from the sidewalk. Every customer carried a different story, yet somehow they all left carrying a different book than the one they originally intended to buy. My closest friend, Hannah, liked teasing me that I spent so much time matching readers with novels that I had forgotten how to match my own life with happiness. Claire, she often said while bringing pastries from the bakery next door, one day someone is going to walk through that front door and completely rearrange your carefully organized life. I always smiled and dismissed the idea. People only come here looking for books. Hannah laughed every single time. That is what you think. One quiet Thursday afternoon, just as autumn sunlight settled across the polished wooden floor, an official envelope arrived bearing the seal of the Boston Historical Preservation Council. Curious, I opened it immediately. Inside was an invitation requesting my participation in an ambitious community project to restore one of the city's oldest public libraries, transforming the aging building into a welcoming cultural space for future generations. They specifically wanted local bookstore owners, librarians, teachers, and preservation specialists to help shape the library's new vision. I reread the letter twice before placing it carefully on the counter. The project sounded meaningful, yet something about accepting such an invitation felt unexpectedly intimidating. My comfortable little world had become wonderfully predictable, and stepping beyond it seemed strangely unfamiliar. As the afternoon light slowly deepened into rich shades of gold, I looked around my quiet bookstore once more. The shelves, the books, the warm coffee aroma, and the peaceful silence had carried me through some of the hardest years of my life. I believed I already understood what golden ambience truly meant. I had no way of knowing that a single meeting inside an old library would soon reveal that the warmest light never came from windows, beautiful architecture, or carefully arranged bookshelves. It came from the unexpected arrival of someone whose presence would quietly illuminate every ordinary day that followed. 3 days later, I found myself standing in front of one of Boston's oldest public libraries just after 9 o'clock on a cool autumn morning. The stately brick building had clearly witnessed generations of readers passing through its doors, yet years of neglect had quietly stolen much of its former beauty. Tall windows overlooked a courtyard scattered with fallen amber leaves, carved stone columns framed the entrance, and faded wooden doors carried the kind of character that modern architecture rarely managed to capture. Even before stepping inside, I understood why the Preservation Council wanted to save it instead of replacing it. Some places deserved another chapter rather than a final page. Volunteers, architects, teachers, librarians, and local business owners gradually gathered in the spacious entrance hall, exchanging introductions while studying large restoration plans displayed across several tables. The atmosphere felt hopeful rather than formal. Everyone seemed united by the simple belief that communities deserved beautiful places where stories could continue bringing people together. I signed my name on the registration sheet, accepted a visitor badge, and quietly moved toward one of the architectural drawings spread across the nearest table. Whoever designed the renovation clearly understood that libraries should invite people to stay rather than simply borrow books and leave. Large reading areas overlooked the gardens, comfortable seating surrounded tall windows, and every room emphasized warmth instead of efficiency. As I studied the plans, a calm voice beside me quietly asked, "If you could change one thing, what would it be?" I turned and found myself looking at a woman I had never met before. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length light brown hair, warm hazel eyes, and an expression that somehow balanced quiet confidence with genuine kindness. She wore a cream-colored blazer over a pale blue blouse instead of the formal business suit I expected from an architect. Something about her immediately felt approachable. I looked back at the drawings before answering. I would move the children's reading room closer to the windows. She smiled with obvious curiosity. Why? Because children remember how places make them feel long before they remember the books themselves. Natural light invites them to stay. Her smile widened ever so slightly. I was hoping someone would say exactly that. I laughed softly. You designed this, did not you? Part of it. She extended her hand naturally. I am Olivia Carter. I shook her hand. Claire Bennett. The bookstore owner? I blinked in surprise. You already know who I am? The Preservation Council spoke very highly of Harbor Pages. She glanced around the nearly empty library before adding, apparently your recommendations have convinced half of Boston to read novels they never intended to buy. I smiled despite myself. That sounds slightly exaggerated. Perhaps. She laughed gently, but I was curious to meet the person behind the stories. Before I could answer, the project coordinator welcomed everyone and invited us to gather for the opening presentation. Olivia and I happened to choose seats beside each other, and throughout the morning we exchanged quiet observations about reading spaces, neighborhood libraries, and why beautiful architecture could influence the way people experience books. We disagreed occasionally, yet every disagreement became another thoughtful conversation instead of an argument. During the lunch break, we wandered slowly through the empty second floor where dust-covered shelves waited patiently for restoration. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, covering the worn wooden floor with warm bands of golden light. Olivia stopped walking for a moment and looked around the silent room with unmistakable admiration. One day, she said quietly, this entire floor will feel like home to someone who has not found one anywhere else. I looked at the glowing sunlight stretching across the empty shelves before turning back toward her. For reasons I could not explain, the library no longer felt like the most interesting place inside that building. Somehow, without realizing when it happened, the conversation itself had quietly become the beginning of something I had not expected to find. Over the following weeks, the restoration project quietly settled into a comfortable rhythm that blended naturally with my daily routine. Every morning I opened Harbor Pages, welcomed familiar customers, recommended novels, and watched the sunlight slowly move across the wooden shelves before driving to the library each afternoon. At first, I believed I was volunteering because I cared about preserving one of Boston's oldest public buildings. Gradually, I realized another reason had begun drawing me there with equal determination. Olivia was almost always the first person I saw after walking through the library doors. She greeted every volunteer with the same calm smile, remembered everyone's name without hesitation, and somehow made complicated architectural discussions feel like ordinary conversations between friends. She never carried herself like someone trying to impress people. Instead, she seemed genuinely fascinated by how small details could change the way a room made someone feel. One afternoon, we spent nearly an hour debating the placement of reading chairs beside the tallest windows on the second floor. I argued that readers naturally drifted toward sunlight, while Olivia insisted the seating should also encourage quiet conversations between strangers who might one day become friends. Books create connections, she said while moving a chair only a few feet across the room. The furniture should quietly encourage those connections instead of interrupting them. I laughed softly. You make chairs sound philosophical. She smiled without looking up. Everything inside a library tells part of the story. Her answer stayed with me long after the conversation ended. During lunch breaks, we often escaped the busy construction noise by sitting in the courtyard beneath an old maple tree whose leaves had begun turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. We shared sandwiches from the neighborhood cafe across the street, traded favorite book recommendations, and discovered we had both grown up believing that libraries were among the safest places in the world. Olivia admitted that when she was 12 years old, she spent nearly every Saturday reading in her hometown library because it felt peaceful in ways her busy childhood home never did. I confess that after my divorce, my bookstore had quietly become the place where I learned to rebuild my life one ordinary day at a time. She listened carefully without interrupting, never offering advice when understanding was enough. Those simple conversations gradually became my favorite part of every afternoon. As the renovation continued, the library slowly transformed before our eyes. Fresh wooden shelves replaced damaged ones. Warm lighting filled rooms that had once felt forgotten. Comfortable reading spaces appeared beneath restored windows, and volunteers proudly unpacked hundreds of donated books, waiting to welcome future readers. Olivia walked through every room with thoughtful attention, adjusting colors, furniture, and lighting until each space felt warm instead of merely beautiful. Watching her work revealed something remarkable. She was not designing rooms simply to impress visitors. She was creating places where people could feel safe enough to slow down, breathe deeply, and believe that tomorrow might be brighter than today. One evening, after nearly everyone else had gone home, we stood together on the second floor watching the setting sun pour through the newly cleaned windows. The golden light stretched across polished floors and freshly filled bookshelves, transforming the quiet library into something almost magical. Olivia folded her arms gently and smiled at the peaceful scene before us. "This," she whispered, "is what I've been trying to create." I looked around the room before asking, "Beautiful architecture?" She slowly shook her head. No, her warm hazel eyes met mine with quiet sincerity, a feeling that makes someone want to stay a little longer than they planned. Without realizing it, I smiled back. For reasons I could not fully explain, I already understood exactly what she meant, because somewhere between shelves of books, afternoon conversations, and sunlight spilling across old wooden floors, I had begun staying much longer than I ever intended, and it was no longer the library that kept me there. As October slowly settled over Boston, the library no longer resembled the forgotten building we had first walked into weeks earlier. Fresh paint covered the aging walls, polished wooden shelves stretched across bright reading rooms, and every afternoon the warm sunlight spilling through the restored windows painted the entire building in soft shades of gold. Volunteers often stopped working for just a few moments to admire how dramatically everything had changed. I quietly found myself doing the same, although I was no longer certain the building was the greatest transformation taking place. Somewhere between afternoon conversations, shared lunches, and countless hours spent arranging books together, something inside me had begun changing as well. One Friday evening, after the last volunteer had gone home, Olivia invited me to visit another project she had completed several years earlier. Curious, I followed her across the city to a small historic community center that had once been an abandoned warehouse. The moment we stepped inside, I understood why she wanted me to see it. Warm wood, soft lighting, comfortable reading corners, large windows, carefully chosen colors, and quiet gathering spaces blended together so naturally that the entire building seemed to encourage people to slow down and breathe. Children laughed while working on homework around a long table. Older neighbors played chess beside a fireplace, and several readers sat peacefully near the windows without speaking a single word. Nothing about the space demanded attention, yet everything invited people to remain a little longer than they intended. Olivia watched the room quietly before asking, "How does this place make you feel?" I looked around once more before answering honestly. "Safe." She smiled gently. "That is always my first goal." We walked slowly through the building while she explained how architecture could influence emotions just as deeply as music, literature, or art. "People often think beautiful spaces exist to impress visitors," she said. "I think beautiful spaces exist to help people lower their guard." Her words stayed with me as we paused beside a wide window overlooking a small garden glowing beneath the golden light of late afternoon. "Why does warm light matter so much to you?" I finally asked. Olivia remained quiet for several seconds before answering. "Because warm light tells people they are welcome." She brushed her fingertips lightly across the wooden window frame. "Cold spaces remind us to leave. Warm spaces quietly ask us to stay." I smiled thoughtfully. "That sounds almost like something from one of my favorite novels." She laughed softly. "Maybe that is why we understand each other." On the drive back to Boston, we spoke about childhood memories, favorite neighborhoods, and the simple places that had quietly shaped our lives. I realized almost every meaningful memory Olivia described involved sunlight through windows, libraries, bookstores, family kitchens, or community centers where people gathered without needing a special occasion. She never talked about impressive buildings because of their size. She admired them because of how they made people feel. When we finally returned to the library, the evening sun poured through the restored second-floor windows exactly as it had the day we first stood there together. The shelves were now filled with carefully selected books, comfortable chairs waited beside reading lamps, and every corner reflected the warmth Olivia had spent months creating. She looked around the peaceful room with quiet satisfaction before turning toward me. "Do you know what makes this place complete now?" I expected her to mention the books or the volunteers. Instead, she smiled with gentle certainty and said, "It is no longer just a library. It has become somewhere people will remember long after they leave." Standing beside her in the warm evening light, I realized she had unknowingly described something else entirely, because without noticing exactly when it happened, she had quietly become the kind of person I knew I would remember long after every ordinary afternoon we shared had become another cherished memory. By the middle of November, the library had become more than a restoration project. It had quietly become part of our lives. Every afternoon followed a familiar rhythm that no longer needed planning. I closed Harbor Pages shortly after lunch, carried fresh pastries from the bakery next door, and drove across Boston knowing Olivia would already be waiting somewhere inside the library with rolled architectural drawings tucked beneath one arm and another thoughtful idea she wanted to discuss. The volunteers began teasing us long before either of us admitted anything to ourselves. They noticed how naturally we searched for each other in every room, how every conversation somehow ended with shared laughter, and how even difficult decisions became easier whenever we solved them together. We always laughed off the friendly jokes, yet neither of us ever seemed eager to deny them too strongly. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, the final shipment of custom reading tables arrived. While the volunteers assembled furniture downstairs, Olivia invited me to help arrange the second-floor reading lounge. Together we experimented with different layouts, moving chairs only a few inches at a time until every seat seemed to welcome both solitude and conversation. After nearly an hour, I smiled and asked, "Does anyone besides you actually notice these tiny changes?" Olivia laughed softly while stepping back to study the room. "Most people will never notice them consciously." She glanced toward the sunlit windows before continuing. "They will simply feel more comfortable without understanding why." I folded my arms with playful curiosity. "So, your greatest success happens when nobody realizes you did anything at all." She nodded with a gentle smile. "Exactly." I looked around the room one more time and suddenly understood that her kindness worked in exactly the same way. She never tried to become the center of attention. She quietly improved every space and every conversation simply by being present. Later that afternoon, a local elementary school visited the unfinished library for a preview tour. The children raced excitedly through the colorful reading areas while teachers patiently guided them toward story corners that would officially open in only a few weeks. Olivia knelt beside a young girl who hesitated outside the children's section, gently asking what kinds of books she enjoyed. Within moments, she had recommended 3 different stories and, personally, walked the little girl to the shelf where they would soon be displayed. Watching that simple interaction filled me with unexpected warmth. Olivia did not merely design beautiful places. She instinctively knew how to help people feel that they belonged inside them. After the children left, we remained in the quiet library finishing small details before sunset. As golden light poured across the polished wooden floor, Olivia carefully adjusted a reading lamp beside one of the window seats. "Perfect," she whispered almost to herself. I walked over and sat in the chair she had just positioned. Looking through the tall window toward the glowing autumn trees outside, I immediately understood why she had insisted on moving it only a few inches. The entire room seemed warmer from that single seat. "You were right," I admitted. "This feels completely different." She smiled with quiet satisfaction before sitting in the chair beside mine. For several peaceful minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence felt effortless rather than awkward, the kind shared only by people who no longer felt any need to impress one another. Eventually, I turned toward her and asked the question that had quietly followed me for weeks. "Olivia, have you ever built a place that truly felt like home for yourself?" Her smile softened almost imperceptibly. She looked toward the fading sunlight before answering in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Not yet." Those 2 simple words lingered between us long after the room grew quiet again. As I watched the last rays of golden light disappear beyond the windows, I realized I had been wondering the very same thing about my own life, and for the first time in years, I found myself hoping that whatever home looked like in the future, it might somehow include the woman sitting peacefully beside me. The question I asked lingered quietly between us long after the last traces of sunlight disappeared from the library windows. Olivia remained seated beside me, her hands resting loosely in her lap, while the newly restored reading room settled into peaceful evening silence. She smiled, but there was a quiet sadness behind it that I had never noticed before. After several moments, she finally looked toward the rows of books surrounding us instead of directly at me. "When I was growing up," she began softly, "my parents both worked long hours. They loved me, but our house rarely felt calm. Everyone hurried from one responsibility to another. There was always another meeting, another deadline, another place we needed to be." She paused before continuing. "One afternoon, my grandmother took me to our neighborhood library. I remember sitting beside a tall window where warm sunlight covered the pages of the book I was reading. Nobody expected anything from me there. Nobody was rushing. For the first time, I understood what peace actually felt like." I listened without interrupting. "After my grandmother passed away," Olivia continued, "I kept returning to libraries because they reminded me that gentle places could still exist even after difficult seasons of life." She smiled faintly. "That is why I became an architect. I stopped believing buildings were only made of wood, stone, and glass. I started believing they could quietly protect people without ever saying a word." I looked around the room we had spent months helping restore. Suddenly, every design decision made perfect sense. Every carefully positioned chair, every reading lamp, every window seat overlooking the gardens had grown from that single childhood memory. "So, every project you design," I began. She nodded gently. "Is my way of giving someone else the feeling my grandmother once gave me." My heart tightened with quiet admiration. That is one of the most beautiful reasons I have ever heard for choosing a career. She laughed softly, though her eyes remained thoughtful. "Most clients think I simply enjoy natural light." We both smiled before falling comfortably silent again. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season drifted gently past the tall windows, covering the library courtyard in a delicate, white blanket. Volunteers downstairs continued organizing books for the opening, while soft conversations echoed faintly through the building. Everything around us felt peaceful. Eventually, Olivia stood and slowly walked toward one of the large windows. I joined her a moment later. Together we watched the snow settle across the garden benches and winding stone paths. "Do you know something I realized recently?" she asked. "What?" "For years I believed I was designing places that felt like home." She turned toward me with quiet sincerity. "Then somewhere during this project, I realized it was never really about buildings." I looked at her curiously. "What was it about?" She smiled with the kind of honesty that made every word feel important. "It was always about the people who make those places worth returning to." My breath caught for only a second before I looked back toward the falling snow. I understood exactly what she meant, yet neither of us seemed ready to say anything more. Some feelings needed time before they could become words. As we locked the library together later that evening, the snow continued falling beneath the warm glow of the streetlights. The city felt quieter than usual, wrapped in a peaceful stillness that seemed to slow every passing moment. Before walking toward our cars, Olivia handed me a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Inside was my favorite cinnamon pastry, still warm from the oven. "You forgot to stop by this morning," she said with a gentle smile. I laughed in surprise. "You remembered." "I remember more than you probably realize." She waved goodbye before driving away into the softly falling snow. I remained standing beside the library for another minute, holding the warm pastry in my hands while watching her car disappear around the corner. It occurred to me then that the safest place I had discovered in years was no longer my bookstore or even this beautiful library. Somehow, without either of us planning it, the feeling of home had quietly begun following wherever Olivia happened to be. The first snowfall disappeared within a day, leaving Boston wrapped in the crisp brightness that always arrived just before the holiday season. The library restoration entered its final weeks, and every volunteer could feel the excitement building with each completed shelf and carefully arranged reading corner. Yet beneath that growing excitement, another quiet change had begun unfolding. Inside me, every morning I caught myself looking forward to seeing Olivia before I even unlocked Harbor Pages. Every evening, I found reasons to stay at the library a little longer, hoping for just one more conversation before driving home. The project had become the highlight of my days, but I knew deep down it was not because of the building anymore. One Tuesday afternoon, I arrived to find Olivia standing alone near the entrance, studying a letter with an expression I had never seen before. She smiled when she noticed me, yet the smile faded almost as quickly as it appeared. "Everything all right?" I asked gently. She folded the letter and slipped it into her bag. "I think so." We spent the next several hours arranging donated history books, labeling shelves, and checking the final placement of reading tables, but the easy rhythm we usually shared felt noticeably quieter. Olivia answered every question kindly, yet her thoughts seemed somewhere far beyond the library walls. As the last volunteer headed home, she finally looked at me with quiet determination. "Would you have time for coffee?" she asked. We walked to the small cafe across the street where we had shared countless lunches during the project. The familiar corner table beside the window was empty, and snow-covered sidewalks reflected the warm lights from nearby storefronts. After the server brought our coffee, Olivia rested both hands around the mug without taking a sip. "I received an offer this morning," she said softly. I smiled at first, assuming it was good news. "Congratulations." She looked at me with an expression that immediately told me the situation was more complicated than I expected. "It is a remarkable opportunity." I nodded. "Then why do you look unhappy?" She hesitated before answering. "A restoration firm in Seattle wants me to lead the design of several historic community projects. It is the kind of position architects wait years to receive." My heart sank quietly even as I forced myself to smile. "That sounds incredible." "It is." She glanced toward the snowy street outside. "They would need me to relocate shortly after the library opens." Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. The cheerful sounds of the cafe suddenly felt very far away. I stared at the swirling steam rising from my untouched coffee while trying to organize thoughts that no longer seemed willing to cooperate. "Have you decided?" I finally asked. Olivia shook her head. "Not yet." She looked directly at me. Until a few months ago, I would have accepted without hesitation. My chest tightened, but I remained silent. Now, she continued quietly, the decision no longer feels simple. I understood what she meant, yet fear arrived before courage had the chance to answer. I remembered my divorce, the promises I had made to protect my heart, and the certainty that distance eventually changed everything. Instead of telling Olivia what I truly felt, I chose the safer path. I smiled gently and said, "You have always encouraged people to build places that feel like home. Maybe this is simply your next opportunity to do that." She studied my face carefully, as though searching for words I had decided not to say. Finally, she nodded with a faint smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Maybe you are right." We walked back to the library together beneath glowing streetlights, yet the comfortable silence we had always shared felt different now. For the first time since meeting Olivia, I realized that sometimes the hardest distance between two people is not measured in miles. It begins the moment both hearts start protecting each other instead of speaking honestly. The conversation in the cafe stayed with me long after we stepped back into the cold evening air. Snow crunched softly beneath our shoes as we walked toward the library, yet neither of us seemed able to find the easy conversations that had once filled every quiet moment. Olivia smiled whenever I looked at her, but I could see the weight of the decision resting quietly behind her eyes. I told myself that encouraging her to accept the opportunity had been the generous thing to do. After all, I cared about her too much to become the reason she walked away from the career she had spent years building. The problem was that kindness and honesty were not always the same thing. During the following week, the library became busier than ever as volunteers prepared for the grand opening. Boxes of donated books arrived every morning, local artists installed welcoming displays throughout the reading rooms, teachers planned children's programs, and neighborhood families stopped by to admire the remarkable transformation. Outwardly, everything appeared joyful. Inwardly, I found myself counting the days without meaning to. Olivia never mentioned Seattle again, and I never asked whether she had accepted the position. Somehow our silence became an unspoken agreement neither of us had intended to make. One afternoon, I arrived early and discovered Olivia standing alone beside the second-floor windows, carefully adjusting one of the reading chairs we had debated weeks before. The golden winter sunlight poured across the polished wooden floor exactly as it had the first day we imagined what this room could become. She noticed me and smiled warmly. "Do you think it still belongs here?" she asked, resting one hand on the chair. I looked around the peaceful room before nodding. "I think you found the perfect place for it." She smiled softly. "I was hoping you would say that." We spent the next several hours arranging books in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging quiet observations about favorite authors or laughing when we discovered duplicate donations hidden inside the same boxes. Nothing dramatic happened, yet somehow those ordinary hours felt more precious than any grand celebration could have been. As evening approached, a group of neighborhood children visited with handwritten thank you cards for everyone involved in the restoration. One little boy walked directly toward Olivia and handed her a folded drawing of the library surrounded by bright yellow sunlight. Across the top he had carefully written, "Thank you for making this place feel warm." Olivia smiled with unmistakable emotion as she accepted the drawing. After the children left, she carefully slipped the picture into her notebook instead of placing it with the other paperwork. "I think this may be my favorite design review," she said quietly. I laughed, but my heart ached at the thought that someone else might soon benefit from the same kindness that had quietly transformed my own life. That evening, after locking the library doors together, we stood outside watching lights appear one by one across the neighborhood. The building glowed behind us with the same welcoming warmth we had dreamed about from the beginning. Olivia looked at it for a long moment before speaking. "Whatever happens next, this place will always remind me that some of the most meaningful things in life cannot be measured by awards or promotions." I nodded, afraid that if I said too much, my carefully guarded feelings would finally reveal themselves. She turned toward me with a gentle smile. "Thank you for helping me create something that will outlast both of us." I smiled back, though the words settled heavily inside my heart. As I drove home beneath the quiet winter sky, I realized I had spent so much energy convincing myself that letting Olivia go was the loving choice that I had never stopped to ask whether she wanted me to fight for her to stay. Somewhere between protecting her future and protecting my own fears, I had begun losing the courage to tell the one person who mattered most that she had already become the brightest part of every ordinary day. The morning of the library's grand opening arrived wrapped in clear winter skies and brilliant sunshine that poured across Boston like a quiet promise of new beginnings. By 8 o'clock, volunteers hurried through every room making final preparations. Fresh flowers decorated the welcome desk, children's artwork brightened colorful reading corners, polished wooden shelves stood filled with carefully selected books, and soft music drifted gently through the building. Looking around, I could hardly believe this was the same neglected library we had first entered months earlier. Every conversation, every late afternoon, every carefully moved chair had somehow become part of something far greater than any of us could have imagined. Yet despite the excitement surrounding the opening, my thoughts remained fixed on only one question. Had Olivia decided to leave? I had not asked. She had not volunteered the answer. The uncertainty followed me through every task that morning until Hannah quietly found me arranging books near the entrance. She watched me for several seconds before speaking. "Claire, you have alphabetized the same shelf 3 different times." I laughed awkwardly. "Have I?" "You have." She folded her arms with a knowing smile. "You are worried about her." I sighed softly, no longer pretending otherwise. I told her she should follow her dream. Hannah nodded thoughtfully. "Did you tell her how you felt?" I looked away. "No," she smiled gently, though her voice became unusually serious. "Then you did not give her all the information she needed to make that decision." Before I could answer, applause echoed from downstairs as the first visitors entered the beautifully restored library. Families filled the reading rooms, children hurried excitedly toward colorful story corners, teachers greeted former students, and neighbors admired every thoughtful detail of the renovation. The building seemed alive again. I moved through the crowd greeting visitors, answering questions about recommended books, and thanking volunteers, yet every few minutes my eyes searched instinctively for Olivia. Finally, I found her standing near the large second-floor windows where we had shared so many quiet conversations. She was speaking with city officials while smiling politely, but something about her expression seemed distant, as though part of her attention remained somewhere else entirely. After the formal speeches ended and the crowd spread throughout the building, I quietly climbed the staircase toward the second floor. Olivia noticed me almost immediately. "Beautiful turnout," she said warmly. I nodded. "You made this possible." She smiled and gently shook her head. "We made this possible." For a moment, we simply looked around the peaceful room as sunlight poured through the restored windows exactly as it had on the afternoon we first met. Everything we had imagined had finally become real. Olivia reached into her bag and removed a folded envelope. "I wanted to tell you before anyone else," she said softly. My heart immediately began racing. She handed me the envelope, but I did not open it. Instead, I looked directly into her eyes. "Before I read anything," I said quietly, "there is something I should have told you days ago." She remained perfectly still, waiting patiently. My carefully rehearsed reasons for staying silent suddenly felt meaningless. "I kept encouraging you to follow your future because I was afraid asking you to stay would be selfish." I took a slow breath before continuing. "The truth is that somewhere between bookshelves, afternoon coffee, and ordinary conversations, you became the person I looked forward to seeing more than anyone else. I told myself protecting your dream was enough, but I finally understand that hiding my feelings was never kindness. It was fear." Olivia did not speak immediately. Instead, she looked down briefly at the unopened envelope still resting between us before lifting her eyes back to mine with an expression filled equally with relief and quiet hope. In that silent moment, before either of us revealed what the envelope contained, I realized that sometimes the greatest turning point in a life begins with nothing more extraordinary than finally choosing honesty over fear. For several quiet seconds, neither of us spoke. The sounds of celebration drifted faintly upward from the first floor where children laughed, volunteers greeted visitors, and neighbors explored the beautifully restored library we had spent months creating together. Yet inside the peaceful reading room, it felt as though the rest of the world had gently faded away. Olivia looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, one filled not with surprise but with relief. She lowered her eyes briefly toward the unopened envelope still resting in my hands before smiling with unmistakable warmth. "Claire," she whispered, "I kept hoping you would say exactly that." My heart skipped as she slowly reached for the envelope. Instead of asking me to open it, she quietly folded it in half again and slipped it back into her bag. I looked at her in confusion. "You do not want me to read it?" She shook her head gently. "Not yet." We walked together toward the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered courtyard where winter's sunlight reflected across the fresh, white ground, with the same soft glow that had first inspired so many of our conversations. Olivia rested one hand lightly against the wooden window frame before speaking again. When Seattle called, I believed accepting the position would be the obvious decision. It was everything I had worked toward for years. She smiled thoughtfully while watching families arrive below. Then I realized something unexpected. Every accomplishment I imagined celebrating suddenly felt incomplete because the first person I wanted to share it with was you. I remained completely still, letting every word settle inside my heart. "When you encouraged me to leave," she continued softly, "I thought perhaps I had imagined what had been growing between us all these months. I convinced myself that maybe the library meant more to me than it ever did to you." I immediately shook my head. "Never." She laughed quietly, her eyes shining with emotion. "I know that now." I took a slow breath before speaking again. After my divorce, I promised myself I would never build my future around hope alone. I thought protecting myself meant staying silent whenever something became too important. I smiled with quiet honesty. Meeting you reminded me that silence can protect a heart, but it can also keep it from truly living. Olivia stepped a little closer, her expression gentle and peaceful. "Do you remember asking whether I had ever built a place that truly felt like home?" I nodded. "I remember every word." She smiled warmly. "I finally have an answer." My heart beat a little faster as she continued. "Home was never waiting for me in another city. It was slowly taking shape here. One conversation, one shared lunch, one carefully arranged bookshelf at a time." Neither of us reached for dramatic gestures. We simply stood together in the quiet sunlight, smiling with the comfortable certainty that sometimes arrives only after months of patient understanding. Finally, Olivia opened her bag once more and removed the envelope. This time she handed me a single folded page instead of the entire packet. At the bottom was her signed response to the architectural firm. I read only one sentence before looking back up at her. She had respectfully declined the position in Seattle. Seeing my surprised expression, she laughed softly. "Do not misunderstand," she said. "I did not stay because I was afraid to leave. I stayed because I finally knew where I wanted to build the next chapter of my life." Downstairs, applause echoed once again as another group of visitors entered the library, completely unaware that while a restored building was opening its doors to the community, two ordinary lives had quietly opened their hearts to a future neither of them had dared to imagine only a few weeks before. The celebration continued throughout the afternoon, but everything felt wonderfully different after our conversation beside the library windows. The same halls that had once echoed with construction sounds now carried quiet conversations between neighbors discovering favorite authors, children laughing over picture books, and volunteers proudly watching the community enjoy every detail we had worked so carefully to create. Olivia and I moved naturally through the library together, greeting visitors, answering questions, and recommending books, yet every ordinary moment now carried an unspoken sense of peace. Nothing dramatic had changed around us. The building was the same. The books remained on the same shelves. The sunlight still poured through the tall windows exactly as it had every afternoon before. The only difference was that neither of us had anything left to hide. Late that afternoon, after most guests had returned home, the volunteers gathered in the second-floor reading room for a small thank-you reception. The project coordinator thanked everyone for months of dedication before inviting each volunteer to share a favorite memory from the restoration. Some spoke about preserving local history. Others remembered children visiting during construction or neighbors donating treasured family books to the library. When my turn arrived, I looked around the room before smiling quietly. "I thought I came here to help restore an old building," I said. "Instead, this place reminded me that the most important things we build are usually invisible. Trust, friendship, belonging, and hope cannot be measured with blueprints, but every beautiful place is built upon them." Several people nodded thoughtfully. When Olivia stood a few moments later, she looked toward me before addressing the group. "Architecture teaches you how to shape rooms," she said softly. "This project taught me that people shape each other just as deeply. The greatest design decision I made during these past months was never where to place a chair or how to arrange a reading room. It was choosing to slow down long enough to truly know the remarkable people working beside me." Warm applause filled the room, yet I suspected neither of us would ever forget the quiet glance we exchanged more than the applause itself. After the reception ended, Hannah found us standing beside the children's reading corner. She folded her arms with a knowing smile before laughing. "I have been waiting months for the two of you to finally stop pretending." Olivia laughed first, while I felt my face grow warm. "Were we really that obvious?" I asked. Hannah grinned. "Only to everyone except the two of you." Even Olivia shook her head in amused disbelief. Apparently, we were the last people to figure it out. We spent the remainder of the evening helping volunteers tidy the library before locking the doors together for the first time after its official opening. Outside, the streets glowed beneath rows of warm holiday lights stretching across the neighborhood. Snow rested gently along sidewalks, and families carrying borrowed books walked happily toward nearby cafes and homes. The library already felt like the welcoming heart of the community we had imagined from the beginning. Before we reached our cars, Olivia stopped and looked back at the softly illuminated building. "This place is finally alive," she whispered. I followed her gaze before smiling. "Because people are filling it with their own stories now." She nodded gently, and somehow ours became part of it too. As we stood together beneath the quiet winter sky, I realized that the future no longer felt uncertain or frightening. It felt wonderfully ordinary in the best possible way, built not on impossible promises, but on countless small moments of honesty, patience, kindness, and the quiet decision to keep choosing one another every single day that lay ahead. Winter gradually gave way to early spring, and with every passing week the library settled naturally into the life of the neighborhood exactly as we had hoped it would. Every afternoon the reading rooms filled with familiar faces. Children hurried toward their favorite story corner after school, retirees gathered beside the large windows to discuss novels over coffee, students quietly prepared for exams beneath warm reading lamps, and families lingered far longer than they originally intended. Watching the building come alive became one of the greatest joys of my week. Harbor Pages continued welcoming loyal customers each morning, but now my afternoons often ended at the library where Olivia and I volunteered together several days each week, organizing author events, community discussions, and literacy programs that brought people of every generation into the same welcoming space. The rhythm felt so natural that neither of us remembered exactly when it became our normal life. One sunny Saturday, we arrived early to prepare for a children's reading festival. Volunteers decorated tables with colorful flowers while local teachers arranged stacks of illustrated books, and musicians quietly rehearsed near the entrance. Olivia moved through every room greeting volunteers by name, stopping often to kneel beside excited children eager to recommend their favorite stories. Watching her had become one of my favorite parts of every event because she possessed a rare ability to make every person feel genuinely seen. At one point, a little girl approached us holding a library card with obvious pride. "My mom says this is my favorite place in the whole city," she said with a bright smile. Olivia looked at the child warmly before asking, "Why do you like coming here so much?" The little girl thought carefully before answering, "Because it feels like everybody wants you to stay." After she skipped happily toward the picture books, neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, Olivia smiled quietly. That may be the nicest compliment this library will ever receive.
I
Nodded with complete agreement. It is also exactly what you always wanted people to feel. She looked around the sunlit reading room before replying softly, "Now I know why." Later that afternoon, after the festival ended, we carried empty boxes into the second-floor lounge where everything had first begun. The chairs remained exactly where Olivia had insisted they belonged months earlier. Sunlight still stretched across polished wooden floors, and the peaceful silence felt wonderfully familiar. We settled into the two window seats that had become our unofficial place whenever we needed a quiet conversation. Looking around the room, I smiled. "Do you remember asking whether people would notice the smallest details?" Olivia laughed gently. "You said nobody besides me ever would." I nodded toward the reading room below, where visitors naturally gathered in comfortable conversations exactly as she had imagined. I was completely wrong. She smiled with quiet gratitude before taking my hand. The details mattered because the people mattered. I looked at our joined hands and then back toward the library, filled with life below us. It occurred to me that neither of us had been searching for perfection during these past months. We had simply been searching for a place where kindness, patience, and understanding could quietly grow. Somehow we had built far more than a library together. We had created a life filled with ordinary mornings, meaningful work, familiar conversations, and the comforting certainty that the best chapters are rarely the loudest ones. They are the quiet moments that slowly become the foundation of everything that follows. Several months passed so quietly that neither of us could point to the exact day when our shared routines simply became our life. Every morning I unlocked Harbor Pages while Olivia stopped by with fresh coffee before beginning her work on new community design projects throughout Boston. Every afternoon, one or both of us eventually found our way back to the library, not because anyone expected us there, but because it had become the place where so many meaningful chapters of our lives had quietly begun. The neighborhood changed with the seasons, yet the library remained exactly what we had hoped it would become. Children who had once nervously borrowed their very first books now confidently recommended stories to younger readers. Local writers gathered each month to share new ideas. Retirees organized weekly book discussions beside the tall windows, and families treated the building as naturally as they treated their own living rooms. Watching people create memories inside those carefully restored walls reminded me every day that beautiful places are never truly completed by architects or volunteers. They are completed by the lives that slowly unfold inside them. One warm spring evening, after the library closed, Olivia and I remained in the second-floor reading room where everything had first begun. The familiar chairs still overlooked the gardens outside. Sunlight filtered softly through the restored windows, and the peaceful silence felt wonderfully unchanged despite everything our lives had become. I smiled as I looked around the room. "Do you ever think about that first afternoon when you asked me what I would change?" Olivia laughed gently. "You immediately wanted to move the children's reading room closer to the windows. And you already agreed with me." She nodded with quiet amusement. "I was hoping someone would understand why light mattered." I turned toward her with a smile. Now I know it was never just about light. She reached for my hand with the same calm certainty that had always defined her. "No," she said softly. "It was always about helping people believe they belonged somewhere." We sat together for several peaceful minutes without speaking, listening only to birds outside the open windows and the distant sounds of neighbors walking home along the quiet streets. Years earlier, I would have believed that extraordinary love arrived through dramatic moments that changed everything overnight. Instead, life had taught me something infinitely gentler. Real happiness had arrived one ordinary afternoon at a time through shared coffee, patient conversations, thoughtful silences, carefully arranged bookshelves, and countless small choices to keep showing up for one another. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the rooftops, the entire reading room filled once more with the warm golden light that had quietly accompanied every important chapter of our story. I finally understood why that feeling had stayed with me from the beginning. It was never created by architecture, beautiful windows, polished wood, or afternoon sunlight alone. It came from discovering a person whose presence transformed ordinary places into unforgettable memories. I squeezed Olivia's hand gently before we stood together and switched off the final reading lamp. As we stepped outside and locked the library doors behind us, the building glowed peacefully beneath the evening sky, while families continued walking through the neighborhood carrying borrowed books and hopeful conversations into their own homes. I smiled, realizing that some stories never truly end when the final page is turned. They simply continue quietly in the lives people choose to build together, one ordinary day after another, until the place that once felt like a destination becomes the life they had been searching for all along.